Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the problem was final, the house was empty, and his bow was last, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Why would the Pope engage Sherlock Holmes' services? Why did he receive the Legion of Honor from France? And why would he refuse a knighthood?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 227, More Messages. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look at the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
Burt, will you stop messaging? We're trying to get a podcast done here.
Hey, I'm typing as fast as I can move my thumbs.
Oh, God bless text to, or voice to text these days. Well, this is episode 227 of Trifles. You can find the show notes at ihose.co/trifles227. That'll take you to our webpage where we have all the related topics on this, anything you need to know in terms of links, and the ability to sign up for alerts when a new episode comes out. We have an email service that will ping you every time a new episode of Trifles is out. So check that out. And while you're there, give us a rating or a review on your favorite podcast player of choice. I believe, now that I think about it, Apple's the only place to do that. But we would appreciate you telling other people what you like about the show. It will help other people find it. Well, speaking of finding things, you know, the Sherlock Holmes stories are replete with clues. You know, Sherlock Holmes looked all around him. He not only saw, but he observed. And a number of stories that we come across feature Holmes receiving some kind of message or other. We are very familiar, I think, with the telegram and with letters and other missives that find their way to him. And he's able to read things into them. Like for example, Bert, let's take the very first short story. He gets a note from, it didn't say it was from the King of Bohemia, but Holmes was pretty easily able to figure out that it was because of this curious note and the paper on which it was written.
It's a great example because it shows you Holmes' observations, what his eyes see. So from the first, now you just pointed out, this is the very first short story. So now we're in Baker Street. Holmes and Watson have had 2 published cases already. They're established characters. It's a short story. We're in Baker Street. The action begins. Here's the puzzle. A letter is presented. Watson and Holmes have a conversation about it. And this is the first time that the large readership gets really to experience the world of Sherlock Holmes. He's got a piece of paper. He says to Watson, "What do you make of it?" And then Holmes just proceeds to wring it dry like a washcloth. The wording, you know, we have, I don't have the exact words in front of me, but, you know, we have this information about you from all quarters received, the sentence structure, the paper, the watermark, the pen. You know, and it doesn't take but a few minutes before Watson to be told, to his astonishment, that the paper is of German manufacturer, because Geschellkraft is part of the watermark, and that its author is probably someone of high rank of German extraction. So it's a terrific example. So it's not just that Holmes is receiving messages from outside. It's that he is treating things as if they are messages. So if someone comes to see him, and you can observe their cuffs, and you can observe their shoes and their clothes and their demeanor and what they're wearing, what messages, what information, if you think of everything as a message, what information might you be able to extract from it? So it's just a lovely early example of why we find Holmes so fascinating.
It really is. And, that scene sticks with me in my head, not only from reading it, but I remember when I was young, just getting into the Sherlock Holmes stories, I had a collection of audio recordings of the canon starring Ralph Richardson and John Gielgud. And he rattled it off, the E.G. Egria, the Papiergesellschaft. That's where I first learned how to pronounce some German names, is by listening to John Gielgud on the Sherlock Holmes radio half hour there. But that I love that note, and I think we see echoes of that in other messages that were received. The other one, there's two more that come to mind for me. One is in the Hound of the Baskervilles. That wonderful, almost ransom-like note where it's all clipped out of the newspaper except for one word. It was, I think it was, "As you value your life or your reason, keep away from the moor." And moor was the only thing handwritten in, printed in. But Holmes determined what newspaper it was from and the level of education of the sender as a result. He intuited that it was done kind of on the fly because whoever it was that snipped the paper used nail scissors to cut it because of the curvature around it. So just minor things like that he was able to literally make a mountain out of a molehill.
He didn't make a mountain. He drew a mountain of information out of the tiniest little scrap of sand.
There you go.
But that's a great example. I think it wasn't Jessica Schilling in the Baker Street Journal within the last year or two who wrote this enormous paper about it, and I think she won the Morley Montgomery Award for it.
She did indeed. It was about the decoupage in the Hound of the Baskervilles.
Well, it was
right?
more. It was also about the fonts, and how he could have identified the times. And I remember being disappointed to see in her story. Now, I'm not disappointed in anything she did. She literally reconstructed the note and found an issue of the Times of that day, and et cetera, et cetera. And when I read it, in my mental picture of reading it, the thing put together, I always, for some reason, I imagine something that's larger and more substantial. I think of it sort of like a ransom note. Mm. Well, in fact, if you're just clipping things out of the newspaper and adding in one word, it would be quite tiny. And there was an actual photograph of what the reconstruction looks like. And it's a rather large piece of paper compared to the size of the words. And these relatively tiny words sort of sitting like an island in the center.
Yeah.
And that disappointed me because my imagination always makes it much bigger.
Or the paper much smaller.
Yeah.
One of the two. Well, that is a wonderful article. And if folks haven't seen that, we'll provide a link to the Baker Street Journal website, which is handy since they are a sponsor. And you'll hear from them in a little bit. But we'll put that in the show notes. The other note along these lines that sticks with me is from Wisteria Lodge. This was the note that was addressed to Mr. Garcia of Wisteria Lodge. And along comes Inspector Baines, I believe, and he finds it. It says, our own colors, green and white, green open, white shut, main stair, first quarter, seventh right, green bays, Godspeed, D. And Baines says, it's a woman's writing done with a sharp-pointed pen, but the address is either done with another pen or by someone else. It is thicker and bolder, as you see. And here's where Holmes jumps in to demonstrate his ability with reading clues out of messages such as this. "A very remarkable note," said Holmes, glancing it over. "I must compliment you, Mr. Baines, upon your attention to detail in your examination of it. A few trifling points might perhaps be added. The oval seal is undoubtedly a plain sleeve link. What else is of such a shape? The scissors were bent nail scissors. Short as the two snips are, you can distinctly see the same slight curve in each." And the country detective chuckled. I thought I had squeezed all the juice out of it, but I see there was a little left over," he said. And I think of Freddie Jones in that wonderful turn as Inspector Baines in the Granada version of Wisteria Lodge, just capturing that perfectly.
Very nice, very nice.
Yeah. Well, we promised you that you would hear from the Baker Street Journal, and as we are men of our word, here we go. The Baker Street Journal continues to be the leading Sherlockian publication since its founding in 1946 by Edgar W. Smith. In its pages, you'll find both serious scholarship and articles that play the game. The journal is essential reading for anyone interested in Sherlock Holmes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and a world where it's always 1895. If you subscribe to the Baker Street Journal, you'll get 4 quarterly issues as well as the Christmas annual. You don't have to be a member of the BSI or of any Sherlockian society for that matter to subscribe to the journal. It's open to anyone who enjoys talking about, reading about, and writing about Sherlock Holmes. And you can also contribute to the BSJ. Only your imagination limits. Your imagination is the only limitation there. So get on the bandwagon and subscribe to the Baker Street Journal this year. Make it an important part of your commitment to the world of Sherlock Holmes. Just go to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and subscribe today. Yes, well, Holmes did intercept these notes that he was able to discern much information from, but there were other notes, other messages that were, I think, critical to some of the stories. And my supposition here is that had Holmes received more of these messages out of the series, then perhaps he would have been quicker off the mark to bring the case to its conclusion. Then again, there may not have been quite as much dramatic tension had he done so. But why don't we look at a few of those stories and kind of discuss what those messages were all about. So I think probably one of the most prominent is the dancing men. Here, Holmes didn't visually see every single message. Some of them were drawn on chalk on a wall or in an area of Riddlingthorpe Manor. But in some cases, in every case actually, Hilton Cubitt transcribed them onto paper and brought them to Holmes. And what did having that number of messages allow Holmes to do as he was looking at these?
To apply the principles of cryptography, and we know from Holmes' own voice that he is a expert in this particular area. He tells Watson, "I am fairly familiar with all forms of secret writing and am myself the author of a trifling monograph upon the subject in which I analyze 160 separate ciphers." And so it gives Holmes an opportunity to employ frequency analysis and to engage the reader and to engage Watson in the slow but steady deciphering of what seems to be this inexplicable scrawl. But there, although I think it really is a terrific premise, and maybe the jury is out, the premise that if Holmes had more information, perhaps if he was quicker, if there had been more information coming in, bad things could have been averted. But here, my sense is that we know, with the exception of the ultimate message, in which, spoiler alert, in which the villain of the piece is clearly suggesting for some reason, the villain of the piece is sending a coded message to someone saying, basically your end is near, which, is pretty suspect. Why would you be tipping off? If you're going to kill somebody, sending him a note saying, just thought you'd like to know, now would be a grand time to put your affairs in order, because tomorrow you might find it difficult. But skipping over that, really, at the outset or early on, Holmes perhaps should have been more sensitive to the peril secreted in this message. After all, here in this particular situation, you have Hilton Cubitt, you have his American wife. That's a dead giveaway because she comes from someplace outside of England. There's clearly something mysterious going on. These messages have started to appear. The household is upset. Clearly, whoever is creating the messages has relatively unfettered access to the house. This would have indicated to someone that extra levels of security, observation, be wary, might have been really useful, but it doesn't save Hilton Cubitt in the end. But in any case, the Dancing Men Code is the grand example of all of Holmes' experience with ciphers. Certainly one of the top two examples in the canon.
And aren't we fortunate that Elsie Cubitt, she had two of the most common letter in her first name. If she were Sophia or Victoria, where she would have been dead long before. This wouldn't even come to Watson's attention. I'm sure it would have gotten buried in the vaults of Cox and Company. Another failure for Sherlock Holmes.
No. Holmes would have remarked to Watson, I'm sorry, I cannot attend the funeral. I'm still working on these last letters.
Well, and let's turn to another subject in the Bruce Partington plans. This wasn't life or death, although there was a death involved. This was a case of national security and of a spy looking to get hold of some top secret plans. And it just so happened that Holmes was able to triangulate by understanding who the main players were in the kingdom of spies, who might be suspects in this, and cross-reference that with a map of London, which allowed him to see where rail lines ran, and was also fortunate enough to intercept or to observe the newspaper I guess it was agony column postings that were coming from this quote-unquote Pierrot, and was able to determine who that was at that point. Again, just kind of a fortunate intersection of all of these things. Could Holmes have, could he have done better? Could he have done more if there were additional messages that were exchanged in those columns?
Well, he's done quite a lot, and the messages really were incidental in a way to the real meat of the story, which, as you point out, is all of those wonderful maneuvers, the map, the deductions, the rail lines. And it is a terrifically exciting story. It's a story that gets Holmes and Watson out of Baker Street into a location, a tense vigil waiting for someone to arrive. And Holmes, having found the agony column, and we know from previous comments that he's made and Watson's comments that reading the agony column is not something that's new to Sherlock Holmes, it's just part of his practice. He's always got his feelers out to see, exactly what's going on, what's underneath the surface here, and finds this message signed by this French pantomime character, Pierrot. And then he's able to to send a message himself back through that same channel. And that's a lovely thing. He writes to Valentine Walter, "Tonight, same hour, same place, 2 taps, most vitally important, your own safety at stake." And then once he locates Colonel Valentine Walter, there's another message because he has him write to Oberstein. I have a tracing which will make it complete, and this has involved me in extra trouble, and blah, blah, blah. So, and that leads to the whole denouement. But I don't know that he more messages earlier would have moved things along in any way.
Well, in your description there, I think what you have surfaced for me, at least, is this wonderful instance, and we see it again in The Dancing Men, and we see it again in The Red Circle, where Holmes figures out enough of the code to be able to use it himself and send messages back to those who are on the other end of that code, and unknowing that they're dealing with Sherlock Holmes now rather than the intended recipient of their messages. I think it's just a brilliant kind of jujitsu move of turning the message back on the messenger.
Yeah, I was always sad. There are a couple more examples of stories in which messages like this feature frequently. And I was, I don't know that I would say maybe always sad, but it just occurred to me it would have been wonderful if there were more examples of Holmes being able to use the channel. How astonished the villain in The Dancing Men is when he finds that somebody else has been communicating to him through this code. It's like finding somebody else on the street who understands Egyptian hieroglyphs, and you thought you were the only one. Wow. But those examples are things like Gloria Scott, where now admittedly it's not much of a code, and Holmes sort of glances at a telegram and figures out what the meaning of it is. And in any case, the purpose of the message is really just to indicate sort of the end of the case.
Yeah, well, the 5 orange pips, right?
Yes, 5 orange pips.
There's no words even mixed in that. Really, it's just send you some remnants of some fruit.
That's right. I've been flossing my teeth, and here for you are the 5 orange pips. But the big one is the Valley of Fear, and it's occupied a lot in the front end with the coded message, which is also beautifully unraveled by Holmes, where you get all these numbers, and then there are a couple of words that obviously don't feature in the key, which itself is significant to Holmes. The name Douglas and then the name Burlstone. I mean, how wonderful it would have been. And we don't know how Holmes was communicating with Porlock, do we? I mean, now that is interesting.
Must have been through some kind of go-between, some messenger that would have conveyed it, because there was no known address where Porlock was.
Well, maybe it was the agony column, some sort of code in the agony column. I wonder if anybody's written about that, how Holmes...
Or if we're just not remembering it.
It could be in the story, and I'm not remembering it. But
Likely. Well, folks, have we covered enough of the messages here? Are there any that we left out? Send us a message. We are Trifles at ihearofsherlock.com if you would like to email us, or simply comment on the show notes down there. That would be fantastic. Meanwhile, around these parts, it's just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
I really must congratulate you on your attention to detail. There are a few trifling points which might perhaps be added. The seal is a sleeve link. What else is of such a shade? The scissors were bent, nail scissors. Short as the 2 snips are, you can distinctly see the slight curve in each.
Oh, I thought I'd squeezed it dry, Mr. Holmes. But I see there was some still left over after all.